later.
Soon after.
A few inches later.
One winner later. Moments later.
A few moments later.
One shift later.
Moments later.
Much later. Much later.
Many tic-tacs later.
More moments later.
Much later.
One long angry line later.
Day 2, day 3, day 4.
4 to 6 days later.
4 to 6 more days later.
Later. 10 seconds later.
12 seconds later.
Much later.
6 months later.
Later. In the void.
Later. 1 minute 37 seconds later.
2 very boring minutes later.
A few minutes later.
A little longer than a few minutes later. 5 minutes later. 5 minutes later. 11 minutes later. 15 minutes later.
20 minutes later.
2 hours later. 3 hours later. 5 hours later. 346 minutes later.
6 hours later. 6.5 hours later.
7 hours later.
8 hours later.
24 hours later. 48 hours later. 72 hours later. Many hours later.
Later.
Opening night.
12 o'clock midnight. 3:28 a.m.
7:59 a.m.
8:01 p.m. The next day.
Later.
Tomorrow. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later. 6 hours later.
While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how SpongeBob's party is shaping up. 24 hours later. The following day.
1 hour later.
2 hours later. 3 hours later. 8 hours later.
Tomorrow for sure.
1 hour later.
2 hours later.
Eventually.
Meanwhile,
Several bad puns later.
2 hours later. The next morning.
2 hours later.
2 days later.
3 days later.
The next day. The next morning. Meanwhile,
Later that same evening.
2 hours later. The next day. 3 days later.
3 days later. 3 weeks later. Many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Several days later.
1 debt to society later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 1 pair of pants later. 298 frozen patties later. Epilogue. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. 1 week later.
3 weeks later.
Epilogue.
Several song-filled hours later.
Several months later. Thousands of tears later. 16 paranoia-filled days later. Yesterday. 1 extremely annoying shift later. Meanwhile, just then. 2 hours later. 3 days later.
The next morning.
This brief construction montage. 1 frozen wasteland later. Approximately 10 hours later. Early the next morning. 1 week later. 2 weeks later. Just then, by sheer coincidence.
Montage. 3 days later.
Flashback. End of flashback. 1 semester later. Graduation day.
80,000 impressions later.
70 years later.
2,000 years later.
3,000 whoop-whoos later.
3,000 years later. 1 eternity later.